In other words, I do believe that Europe is going through a major political crisis. And if you travel to places like Holland and Scandinavia, you will see that the whole question of the relationship between largely Muslim immigrants and the old liberal white social democracies of these countries are producing enormous social tension, political pressure. Europe itself has expanded, as you know, into Eastern Europe. Britain, as always, remains in some kind of don't know whether we are or we're not in Europe. And so it seems to me that if you wanted proof that the old notion of national monopoly of society is under threat, then you would find it plenty of evidence for it in Europe more generally, and certainly in this country. And what I would say, therefore, is that that once we start trying to systematize this, we can say now that society is explicitly located at least 4 levels. One is the national level, for sure, and it's still probably the most important. The second is the global level, and we have to figure out what sorts of institutions are appropriate to human organization at that level. Thirdly, there have arisen, on the model of the EU and other regional associations, large regional federations in some parts of the world. ASEAN in Asia, Mercosur in South America, NAFTA in North America and Central America. So we also have the prospect of regional federation being offered, as it is in Europe now, as a complement to or alternative to national society. And then finally, of course, there has been a considerable growth in attachment to local associations. In other words, there's the localism, the emphasis on the people that you live most closely with, has certainly acquired new salience in the context of, to some extent, of the devolution of national power. And this localism has often explicitly been connected to globalism. In other words, that what we're looking at is the devolution of national society downwards into more local units and upwards into more global forms of association. And the two ends of it, as it were, the bigger and the smaller, are somehow complementary to each other. And within that, there is also the question of what is the relationship between each nation state and the regional federation of which it is a part. So I think we're living in very interesting times. And one of the questions that has animated me is what would be an appropriate anthropological strategy for studying society in this mobile and plural sense. And I've drawn some inspiration from the late 18th century philosophers, I've referred to them already, but particularly to Immanuel Kant. Now, I've put on your reading list a piece that he wrote towards the end of his life called Perpetual Peace, a philosophical sketch. Now, one of the things that is not widely known, that Immanuel Kant invented the word anthropology in its modern sense. He gave lectures for 30 years on anthropology. He called them anthropology from a pragmatic point of view, and he made some money from giving these lectures, and so he never published them because he thought if he published them he might sort of undermine his capacity to charge fees next year. Anyway, having done these lectures for 30 years, he agreed eventually to publish them. And he used this word anthropology, which of course had existed before, but had not been used to describe the systematic study of mankind as a whole, or of humanity as a whole, until he did it. And in The Perpetual Peace and in his Anthropology, he posed the following question. I mean, he could see that European society was becoming organized in states, increasingly nation states. He could also see that the international relations were becoming formed as coalitions of these states entering into warlike encounters with them. And he posed the question as to how it might be that humanity could form a kind of legal framework for association, for social relations, beyond the boundaries of states. I mean, if you accept that states establish laws that are binding on their citizens and are able to control violence and able to administer the laws, what happens beyond the boundaries of these states? And he lived in a port in the Baltic called Königsberg, and he met a lot of sailors from Holland and Portugal and so on, and he was very interested in them as to how they conceived of the interactions that they made with people around the world when they were not under the surveillance or administration of law by states. And he felt that there was going to be a time when we would have to form societies that were not predicated on territorial states as their inevitable instrument. And so he asked the question, what human properties, what things do we have in common that might be the basis for forming such a society? It's really the same question that all the liberal philosophers of the Enlightenment asked about democracy. If we're not going to form democracy on arbitrary distinctions between unequal classes, if we're going to form it in such a way that everyone has the same equal rights, what should these equal rights be based on? What is it that all human beings have in common? What is our common human nature, in other words? And this is the question that Kant was concerned with. And he thought that perhaps some answers could be found from on the basis of an analysis of human nature, that somehow all human beings are of a certain kind. He also thought perhaps that even though they were not natural, that child-rearing practices in most parts of the world might reveal some common human cultural traits. He was also very interested in the reports coming out from James Cook in the Pacific and from North America on the Native American tribes. He absorbed a great deal of this exotic material as a basis for challenging some of his generalizations. And he asked questions like this, what is the minimum that a stranger can expect from a host society anywhere in the world? You know, he's saying one of the questions really, if we're going to be operating outside our depth, outside our home society, is we need to know whether there are some common human prescriptions for dealing with strangers. And so he carried out this inquiry using the best material he could, and he came up with the answer that the minimum that a stranger can expect is not to be killed. Not to be killed. I mean, that's killed.